The morning of March 8, 1945, brought urgency to the Bomb Command headquarters on Guam. Reconnaissance photos spread across the plotting table told a story that demanded action. The target folders lay waiting, each one packed with intelligence about what lay below. Major General Curtis LeMay pulled on his cigar in the dimness, studying the photographs with the intensity of a man who understood what they meant. Tokyo's manufacturing districts sprawled across the images, thousands upon thousands of small factories woven through residential neighborhoods like thread through cloth. Machine shops occupied wooden buildings. Parts manufacturers operated from homes that had been converted into workshops. The entire Japanese war production system, dispersed and hidden among the people. A message had just arrived from reconnaissance pilots who'd flown over Tokyo. Cloud cover was minimal. Wind conditions looked favorable. The target zones, confirmed as densely populated with cottage workshops and small-scale production facilities. LeMay set his coffee cup down and reached for the operations telephone. Within hours, 334 B-29 super fortresses would thunder off the runway from airfields scattered across Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. What nobody in that room understood at that moment was that this single decision would unleash the most catastrophic firebombing campaign the world had ever witnessed. The Pacific War had taught American commanders a hard lesson. Japanese manufacturing didn't concentrate in massive complexes like those in Detroit or Pittsburgh. Instead, it scattered across cities, hidden within civilian neighborhoods. Cut those supply lines, and the entire Japanese military machine would seize up and stop. Japan's manufacturing approach had evolved over decades into something fundamentally different from Western industrial production. More than half of Tokyo's war output came from tiny workshops employing fewer than 30 workers. Subcontractors making aircraft components worked in residential districts. Metal fabrication happened in backyard operations. Precision instruments were assembled in converted temples. The Mitsubishi aircraft works alone depended on over 300 separate suppliers fanned throughout the Tokyo metropolitan area. The B-29 Super Fortress represented the absolute peak of American aviation technology. An aircraft that displaced 20 tons empty and powered by 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone radial engines, each generating 2,200 horsepower. Major General Curtis Emerson LeMay commanded 345 operational B-29s spread across those 3 island airfields. Each bomber carried an 11-person crew and could haul 20,000 pounds of ordnance to targets 1,500 miles distant. The B-29 program had consumed $3.7 billion, the most expensive weapons project of the entire war. Aircraft that could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything else in existence. Yet the strategy that had worked against Germany, daylight precision bombing, faced completely different mathematics when targeting Japan. High-altitude bombing runs achieved hit rates below 5%. Pilots discovered something terrifying. Jet stream winds that screamed across Japan at altitudes above 250 miles per hour. Captain Robert McNamara, a Harvard man with a sharp mind for operations research and statistical analysis, had studied those numbers intensely as part of the Army Air Force's Office of Statistical Control. McNamara knew something fundamental. Strategic bombing ultimately reduced to mathematics. Tonnage per sortie, target elimination percentages, cost per square mile of manufacturing capacity destroyed. The gap between success and stalemate often came down to raw payload efficiency and how wisely you selected your targets. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Control Officer Jingiro Fujihara sat reviewing manufacturing dispersal reports for the Japanese Planning Committee. Ever since the Doolittle Raid of 1942, military authorities had ordered critical war assembly scattered into urban zones. Aircraft engine components manufactured in Asakusa, electrical systems produced in Fukugawa, ball bearings fabricated in Sumida Ward, hundreds of small workshops integrated directly into residential neighborhoods, a strategy designed specifically to defeat concentrated bombing attacks. Against high-altitude precision bombing, it had worked. American B-29s flying at 30,000 feet couldn't even hit large factory complexes consistently. But Fujihara harbored a deeper fear: fire. Tokyo had burned before, catastrophically, during the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. The vulnerability of Japanese cities to conflagration was deeply understood. Now, with American bombers appearing almost daily, that nightmare scenario edged closer to reality. The American bombing campaign through February 1945 had achieved almost nothing. 21 Bomber Command had flown 22 missions against Japanese targets since November. The results staggered in their poor outcome. The Nakajima aircraft engine plant at Musashino had been attacked 7 times. Total damage, less than 4% of the facility gone. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, had staked his reputation and the future of an independent air force on the B-29 program. Political pressure mounted relentlessly. Congress demanded answers about billions spent on super fortresses that couldn't hit their targets. The Navy pushed back, arguing that carrier aviation proved more effective. The Army prepared for invasion, convinced that air power alone would never force Japanese surrender. Intelligence officer Lieutenant Colonel Robert Olds compiled target analyses that exposed the core problem. Japanese weather patterns created unique obstacles. Cloud cover constantly obscured targets. The jet stream scattered bombs miles from their aim points. Japanese fighter interceptors had learned to exploit the B-29's vulnerable moments during bomb runs. Loss rates approached 6% per mission, unsustainable for sustained operations. Then, at 17:35 hours on March 9th, the first B-29 lifted off from Northfield on Guam. Unlike every previous mission, this bomber had been stripped of defensive armament except the tail guns. Ammunition removed, armor plating torn out, every pound of weight savings converted into additional incendiary bomb capacity. LeMay's tactical revolution was breathtaking in its boldness. Night attack instead of day. Low altitude instead of high, 5,000 to 9,000 feet instead of 30,000. Incendiary clusters instead of high explosives. The entire conventional wisdom of strategic bombing inverted completely. Weather forecasts predicted ideal conditions. Surface winds of 28 miles per hour would fan flames across target districts. Low humidity would accelerate fire spread. Clear skies would give Pathfinder aircraft excellent visibility. The calculations were devastating in their clarity. Each B-29 carried 40 clusters of AN-69 incendiary bombs. Each cluster contained 38 individual bomblets filled with napalm gel. Temperature at ignition exceeded 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Burning time roughly 6 minutes. Total incendiary load per aircraft, 6 tons. Multiply by 334 bombers launched. The equation yielded 1,665 tons of incendiaries targeting approximately 12 square miles. Tokyo's fire defenses existed in name only. 8,000 firefighters for a city of 7 million people. 3 ladder trucks capable of reaching above 2 stories. No pressurized water system in most residential districts. Narrow streets that would trap evacuating civilians. Wooden buildings separated by mere inches rather than feet. Air raid shelters virtually didn't exist. The government believed their construction would damage morale by suggesting Tokyo could actually be bombed. The first Pathfinder aircraft arrived over Tokyo at 0008 on March 10th. Using radar navigation, they identified the aiming point in the Shitamachi district, the most densely populated area of the entire city. Lead Pathfinders dropped their incendiaries in parallel lines, creating a flaming X visible from 50 miles away. Following squadrons simply aimed for the burning cross, expanding the conflagration outward. Squadron after squadron arrived in a 3-hour procession. 279 B-29s reached the target zone. The inferno spread exactly as the operational planners had predicted. Individual fires merged into area conflagration. Area conflagration escalated into firestorm. Temperatures at ground level exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Superheated air rose with such violence it created tornado-force winds at ground level, sucking oxygen from shelters and feeding fresh air to flames. By 2 a.m. on March 10th, 16 square miles of Tokyo were burning. Police reports described scenes of unimaginable horror. Canals boiling, asphalt streets melting, glass windows liquefying and flowing like water, metal lampposts bending from the heat, Fire department communications collapsed completely as telephone lines burned. Tail gunner Sergeant James Krantz reported his guns were unnecessary. Japanese fighters couldn't operate in the superheated air over the city. Anti-aircraft crews abandoned their positions, fleeing the advancing inferno. The real enemy was turbulence from thermal columns that could flip a 60-ton bomber like a leaf in a hurricane. Pilots reported they could smell burning flesh at 5,000 feet altitude. The devastation exceeded every projection. 171 buildings eliminated. 1.8 million people rendered homeless. Official death toll 83,793. Actual casualties likely surpassed 100,000. More people dead in 6 hours than any single military action in human history, including the atomic bombings that would follow 5 months later. 1/4 of Tokyo ceased to exist in a single night. Japanese output statistics told the story in stark numerical terms. Aircraft engine assembly in Tokyo reduced by 75% overnight. Precision tool operations eliminated entirely in affected areas. Electronic component fabrication, 12 major suppliers erased completely. Ball bearing facilities, 40% of national capability eliminated. The cascade effects rippled through entire supply chains as component suppliers vanished in flames. On March 11th, reconnaissance aircraft photographed the aftermath. Where dense urban manufacturing districts had existed 48 hours earlier, only ash fields remained, 16 square miles of scorched earth punctuated by occasional concrete structures that had survived the inferno. Factory chimneys stood like grave markers over incinerated facilities. Rail yards twisted into abstract sculptures of melted steel. The psychological impact exceeded even the physical destruction. Worker absenteeism skyrocketed as survivors searched desperately for missing family members. Factory managers reported efficiency drops of 60% among traumatized workers. Military schedules became meaningless as entire supplier networks simply ceased to exist. The myth of the divine wind protecting Japan from foreign invasion evaporated like morning mist. Intelligence intercepts revealed growing panic in Japanese command structures. Navy ministry reports described complete breakdown of coordination. Army procurement officers reported catastrophic disruption of component delivery schedules. Munitions ministry statistics showed irrecoverable losses to precision capabilities. The distributed system that had protected against precision bombing proved fatally vulnerable to area incendiary attack. LeMay ordered the second wave, while Tokyo still burned. On March 11, 285, B-29 struck Nagoya, Japan's aircraft center. The Mitsubishi Aircraft Works had dispersed operations among 300 subcontractors throughout the city. The firestorm eliminated them simultaneously. 2 square miles of manufacturing district vaporized. Aircraft assembly dropped 40% in 24 hours. March 13th brought devastation to Osaka. 274 superfortresses dropped 1,733 tons of incendiaries on Japan's second-largest city. The Osaka arsenal, producing 1/5 of Japan's ammunition, ceased to exist. 8 square miles of commercial districts reduced to ash. 134,744 buildings eliminated. Port facilities handling 30% of Japan's imports burned to the waterline. March 16th witnessed Kobe's annihilation. 331 B-29s transformed Japan's 6th-largest city into an inferno. The Kawasaki shipyards, building 1/3 of Japan's merchant vessels, burned for 3 days. The Mitsubishi and Kawanishi aircraft plants lost 60% of their capability. 7 square miles of urban area eliminated. Transportation networks connecting western Japan to Tokyo severed completely. March 19th completed the 5-day campaign with a return to Nagoya. 290 superfortresses finished what the first raid had started. The Ichi Aircraft Company, producer of naval attack aircraft, lost every dispersed facility simultaneously. Residential districts housing skilled workers vaporized. Technical schools training aircraft mechanics incinerated. 3 additional square miles of capability removed from Japan's war economy. The statistics were irrefutable. In 10 days, B-29s had dropped 9,373 tons of incendiaries on Japanese cities. 42 square miles of urban area obliterated, 1.5 million people homeless. Output indices collapsed, aircraft manufacturing down 68%. The machinery of war had ground to a halt. Munitions assembly dropped 50%. Machine tool operations fell 72%. The whole system depended on each piece working together, and with those connections broken, the entire economy seized up completely. But Lamé was far from finished. Operation Starvation began right alongside the firebombing campaign. B-29s from the 313th Bombardment Wing began scattering naval mines across Japanese waters. These weren't ordinary mines. The AN-MK-25 mines contained magnetic and acoustic sensors that made them nearly impossible to sweep away. Eventually, 12,000 mines would seal off every major port Japan had. The amount of cargo entering the country had already fallen 90% due to submarines. Now it dropped to almost nothing at all. Within days, the shortages became desperate. Steel required iron ore from Manchuria and Korea. Without ships, no ore arrived. Without ore, no steel could be made. Without steel, no weapons could be manufactured. Aluminum depended on bauxite from the southern resource areas. That supply was cut off entirely. Aviation fuel needed crude oil from the Dutch East Indies. The pipelines were severed. Food imports that kept workers alive simply stopped coming. The economy began feeding on itself, consuming whatever remained. Throughout spring, the campaign intensified without mercy. On April 13th, 327 B-29s descended on Tokyo, destroying the Arsenal district completely. 4 days later, 109 superfortresses eliminated Kawasaki's engine plants. By May 14th, 472 bombers struck Nagoya in what became the largest daylight firebombing attack of the entire war. The systematic erasure of Japanese capabilities proceeded with ruthless precision. By late May, even smaller cities were targeted for destruction. Yokohama disappeared in a single night. 6.9 square miles went up in flames. 42% of the city's urban area was obliterated. Tokyo was struck again. Another 16.8 square miles reduced to ash. The capital, which once housed 7 million people, was now half rubble. The Tokyo-Yokohama industrial complex that had produced 35% of Japan's war material simply ceased to exist. The human suffering defied imagination. Each raid created tens of thousands of casualties. Hospitals overflowed with burn victims, yet basic supplies were nowhere to be found. Malnutrition spread through populations as food networks collapsed. Disease erupted as sanitation systems failed. The skilled workers who needed years to master precision manufacturing died by the thousands. That knowledge disappeared with them, irreplaceable and gone forever. By August 1945, systematic annihilation had become routine, almost mechanical. Lamy's target list now included every city with more than 30,000 people. 66 Japanese cities had been set ablaze. 180 square miles of urban area lay destroyed. 21 million Japanese had been displaced from their homes. The foundation that had supported the world's third-largest navy and an army of 5 million had turned to smoking rubble. The manufacturing statistics revealed absolute economic collapse. Aircraft production that had peaked at 2,572 planes in September 1944 fell to 1,131 by July 1945. Engine production dropped 75%. Propeller manufacturing fell 80%. Electronic components were virtually eliminated. The system spiraled downward. No ball bearings meant no engines. No engines meant no aircraft. No aircraft meant no defense against B-29s arriving every night with mechanical reliability. The final numbers were staggering. 147,000 tons of bombs fell. 15,000 sorties were flown. 414 B-29s were lost. Approximately 2,600 American aircrew casualties. Against these losses, Japanese deaths from strategic bombing ranged between 400,000 and 600,000, with millions more wounded or displaced. Tokyo alone lost more civilians in one night than Britain lost throughout the entire war. Prince Fumimaro Konoye testified to American investigators after the war. He was clear about what really mattered. the prolonged bombing by the B-29s. That was the fundamental thing that determined Japan would seek peace. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, the Navy minister, agreed completely. The B-29 was the single most important factor that caused Japan to surrender. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey reached the same conclusion. Japan would have surrendered by November 1945 without invasion, without atomic bombs. Conventional bombing and blockade alone would have done it. The technological revolution changed warfare forever. Strategic bombing had proved itself as a war-winning capability. Entire economies could be eliminated from the air. The need for ground invasion disappeared. The independent air force that General Arnold had imagined became real in 1947, built directly on the B-29's success over Japan. Every bombing campaign afterward would study 1945. American superiority had shown itself to be decisive. Boeing built 3,970 B-29s between 1943 and 1946. Each aircraft cost $639,188, equivalent to $11 million in modern currency. The entire program cost $3.7 billion, more than the Manhattan Project's $2 billion investment. Yet the return was undeniable. Japan's complete obliteration cost 414 B-29s and 2,600 aircrew. Strategic warfare's mathematics had been solved. The moral questions would generate decades of argument. International law in 1945 did not explicitly prohibit area bombing of cities. The Hague Conventions addressed military targets but remained silent on civilian workers. Japanese authorities had deliberately scattered military assembly throughout civilian areas, making distinction impossible. American planners insisted that eliminating war capabilities justified civilian losses. Critics called the deliberate bombing of population centers war crimes. General LeMay never apologized for what he had done. Throughout his life, his position remained unchanged. We were at war with Japan. Japan attacked us. Did you want to kill Japanese, or did you prefer having Americans killed? His reasoning was coldly logical. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, predicted 1 million American casualties. Operation Olympic, the November 1945 assault on Kyushu, expected 250,000 casualties in the opening month alone. Operation Coronet, the March 1946 strike on Honshu, anticipated even worse losses. Japanese documents discovered after the war revealed Operation Ketsu-Go, their defense strategy that mobilized every citizen for resistance. 28 million civilians were organized into combat units. Children received bamboo spears. Suicide attack training reached entire populations. The National Resistance Program expected 20 million Japanese deaths defending their homeland. Measured against these projections, bombing casualties represented only a fraction of invasion costs. The transformation proved irreversible. Japan's Zai-Butsu conglomerates had been shattered. The distributed system that defined Japanese operations was destroyed. Post-war reconstruction required complete reorganization. The Toyota production system and just-in-time manufacturing that would later transform global commerce emerged from 1945's devastation. Technical advancement accelerated beyond imagination. Radar navigation guided Pathfinder aircraft to targets through total darkness. Incendiary chemistry created unstoppable firestorms. Operations research optimized bombing patterns. Command and control systems coordinated hundreds of aircraft across thousands of miles. Electronic warfare jammed Japanese defenses. Modern air warfare's entire foundation traces back to innovations over Japan. The psychological impact was just as profound. Yamato Damashi, the supposedly unconquerable Japanese spirit, had been broken by technology. Divine winds that repelled Mongol fleets could not stop B-29s. The warrior tradition glorifying death before surrender meant nothing against incendiary bombs. The power that dominated East Asia was reduced to ash in 5 months. Defeat became undeniable. Admiral Sumutsu Yoda, Chief of Naval General Staff, later claimed that Soviet entry into the war mattered more than atomic bombs for hastening surrender. But his own staff reports told a different story. Naval intelligence assessments from July 1945 stated clearly that enemy bombardment was rapidly eliminating Japan's capability to continue. Prolonging the war had become impossible. The B-29's influence extended far beyond World War II. Strategic Air Command's nuclear deterrent doctrine emerged directly from 21st Bomber Command experience. The assumption that air power alone could win wars shaped Cold War planning. Vietnam, Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan all saw attempts to recreate 1945's results. Strategic bombing's promises and limits continued influencing military thinking 8 decades later. Japan needed 2 decades to recover. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 provided vital reconstruction work. American occupation authorities, who had overseen the destruction, now supervised rebuilding. The very districts incinerated in 1945 became economic powerhouses by 1965. Toyota City rose from Nagoya's remains. Electronics companies emerged from Tokyo's burned sections. The world's second-largest economy grew from history's most complete destruction. Curtis LeMay received promotion to Lieutenant General 2 weeks after Japan's surrender. His command of Strategic Air Command from 1948 to 1957 shaped American nuclear strategy throughout the Cold War. The same cold logic that determined incendiary loads over Tokyo later determined nuclear targeting of Soviet cities. Mutual assured destruction descended directly from Operation Meeting House's example. Robert McNamara, who had analyzed bombing effectiveness for LeMay, eventually became Secretary of Defense during Vietnam. In his 2003 documentary, The Fog of War, he reflected on the firebombing campaign against Japanese cities. LeMay said if we'd lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals. McNamara agreed. He and LeMay said they were behaving as war criminals. The moral questions raised by the campaign continued echoing through debates about civilian harm and proportionality in warfare. The final B-29 combat mission flew on August 14, 1945, hours before Emperor Hirohito announced surrender. 143 superfortresses struck the Nippon Oil Company refinery at Tsuchizaki. As the bombers returned home, radio operators received the ceasefire order. The strategic bombing campaign that had reduced Japanese capabilities by 70% was finished. The final accounting was complete. 147,000 tons of bombs, 66 cities destroyed, the economy eliminated. In Tokyo Bay, the battleship Nagato rested on the harbor floor, sunk by American carrier aircraft. Once she represented the Imperial Navy's power, her massive guns could hurl 3,200-pound shells 25 miles. Yet they proved worthless against bombers flying from islands 1,500 miles away. The battleship era had ended. Strategic air power's time had begun. Economies could be eliminated from the sky. Curtis LeMay and his B-29s had demonstrated this with calculated precision over burning Japanese cities. The bamboo spears distributed to Japanese civilians for homeland defense were never wielded. They sit today in museums, reminders of a war that ended through aerial annihilation, not invasion. The B-29 had done more than obliterate facilities. It showed the modern world that warfare belonged to the nation with superior technology, resources, and the strategic vision to use them effectively. In the ashes of 66 Japanese cities, the foundation of the modern world order was established.